Hey there. So in 19.2, we're going to talk briefly about population genetics. By the end of this section, you should be able to describe the different types of variation in a population, explain why only natural selection can act upon heritable variation, describe genetic drift, describe bottlenecks, and explain how each evolutionary force can influence a population's allele frequencies. Again, I would like to remind you that it is most important that you actually read your book and do not rely on my summaries. All right, let's get into it. So genetic variance is the way that our genes differ. It's not a complicated concept. You know, I might have an A in a spot where my partner has a G nucleotide, right? So genetic variance, we are all different. We are related to each other by percentage similarity. We have these things called alleles, which are like groups of traits in our DNA, rather. And these alleles are passed from parent to offspring. So an allele for height might be passed from my parents to me, or from me to my offspring. Acquired traits, again, like the length of my hair, are not passed on from generation to generation. So natural selection acts on genetic variance, right? It doesn't act on my haircut, it acts on my height. And so population genetics relies on genetic variance and then seeing how the environment and kind of these natural selection pressures create changes in genetic variance. And so again, heritability is the fraction of the phenotypic variation. It's a terrible definition. I don't know why I'm reading it from the book. Heritability is the ability of something from some gene to be passed on from one generation to the next. We call the diversity of the alleles and the genotypes within a population genetic variance. So the genetic variation of Dayton, Ohio, the genetic variance is, I don't actually know the demographics, so I'm not going to put my foot in my mouth here. But, you know, it's like one set of people, and it might look very, very different from, say, a subset of people in a city in the UK or in Central Africa. And so that is two examples of genetic variance. And then as we're looking at population genetics, then we can start to describe the similarities and differences between these two populations. So there are some examples of things you need to know about population genetics. One is inbreeding. And so we know that, when close relatives inbreed, the chances of bad stuff showing up are more common. So if I mated this cat to her brother, who I also have, although I couldn't do it because they are both spayed and neutered, and they both had a nervousness gene, which they do, they're nervous cats. Because they both have that gene, the chance of that gene being passed on to their offspring would be even higher. Right? So if you breed two nervous cats together and get a generation of even more nervous cats, and then you keep going on that process, that could be really, really bad. And so that's why inbreeding is bad, because these kind of bad alleles that might not be so bad on their own add up and create a situation where, the offspring can't outrun the bad breeding. And so this phenomenon, besides being called inbreeding, is called inbreeding depression. Genetic drift will get covered in more detail in the next video that I did not produce. But genetic drift is just kind of luck. It's how genes change through time in a population. And it's random, and it is more pronounced in smaller populations, right? So if you have a population of 10 people and one of them has red hair, the chances that the next generation are going to have more red hair is higher than if you had a population of 100 people and one person had red hair. And so we just see the genetic drift effects magnified through smaller populations, and that is usually how we're talking about genetic drift. We're talking about rare, endangered, or isolated populations kind of drifting away. It could be good, could be bad. One last thing about genetic drift is the bottleneck effect, which will also be covered in more detail in the other video. But the bottleneck effect is what happens when we have a natural event that either isolates or kills off a bunch of people or individuals and organisms, right? It doesn't have to be people. So antibiotic resistance or pesticide resistance is a great example of this. If I have ants around my house and I lay out poison for them, and 90% of them die, but the 10% that survive are resistant. One, I just made a bunch of pesticide-resistant ants that are going to be a lot harder to kill. And two, those pesticide-resistant ants may experience some sort of bottleneck effect if there are no other ants around for them to breed with. And so the population gets restricted really, really small, and then their genetic variance gets restricted really, really small too. And that can make things like mutation and natural selection operate differently than expected. We had a human bottleneck way back in our genetic history, we believe. But there is a great other course at Wright State called Population Genetics that you should take if you're interested in this. All right. All right, I'm coughing to death here. The last section of 19.2 has to do with gene flow. So gene flow is kind of intentional. Well, not intentional, but it's the flow of genes in and out of a population, alleles in and out of a population, due to migration, either of individuals or of, the offspring. And so if we have like a single cat in my example from earlier that is from a different genetic makeup and he moves into my house and starts reproducing with one of my female cats, then that would be gene flow. Gene flow introduces genetic variance into offspring, right? And we can think about that in all different ways, like trees dispersing their seeds places. It's all gene flow. So mutation occurs kind of before the gene flow, right? It occurs during reproduction. Excuse me. And the appearance of new mutations is the most common way that we get new genetic variants. So I don't know, maybe there's a mutation in my cats that wasn't there in their parents' generation that makes them super nervous. That would be a mutation. Mutations can be situations where you'll still have kind of random mating. Non-random mating is when individuals non-randomly mate with their peers. So we like to think that we do non-random mating, right? We choose our mates intentionally. In animals, they also choose mates intentionally. Birds might choose a partner that has the brightest shade of red or the biggest tail feathers. And so over time, non-random mating can cause changes in populations in population genetics. The last thing to think about when thinking about population variation is environmental variance. And so this, again, is like phenotypic changes that might not result in genetic changes. For example, if you are out in the sun a lot, you might develop freckles, which is, changes in the melatonin in your melatonin? Changes in the structure of your skin that, help protect you from the sun. Just because you have that doesn't mean that appearance will be passed down to future generations. But the genetic makeup of that, the genetic makeup of my body can respond to that, may be passed down to future generations. So we can see this sort of stuff, environmental variance, show up very often in geographical variation, right? The farther south you go, the more sun exposure you get, maybe the more pigmentation in your skin. Okay, that's it for 19.2.